Let's continue our discussion on surplus value. Remember, we can take those columns from each individual buyer and seller and actually plot those points and come up with a demand curve as well as a supply curve. And then we can note where our equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity are located. The area here above the price and below the demand curve, note the price is 50 and the demand curve is downward sloping, the green line. That area, that triangle there, we call the area of consumer surplus. Now the area below price and above the supply curve, above the red line, we refer to that as the producer surplus. Those two areas together we call total economic surplus, or just economic surplus for short. Now, we can also calculate this area. The consumer surplus area is remember how we calculate a triangle? It's just the height times the width divided by 2. In this case, the height is 100 minus 50, and the width is 5, and then we divide that by 2. In this case, it would be 250 divided by 2, or 125. To calculate the producer surplus, the same thing, the height times the width divided by 2. The numbers here would be 50 minus 0, the height is 50, the width is 5, and then we divide that total area by 2 to get the area of the triangle. That's also 125. The way I drew this basically made both areas exactly the same size. Now the total surplus area is the total area of both surpluses, and that's the height times the width divided by 2. In this case, it's 100 minus 0 times 5 divided by 2, or 500 divided by 2 equals 250. We notice that consumer surplus plus producer surplus equal 250. Now what we want to do is a little more analysis here. If the demand curve and the supply curve were different slopes, what would the surplus areas indicate? Here we see our equilibrium again. In this case, the equilibrium price would be 40, and the area above the price and below the demand curve would be the consumer surplus. Now the area above the supply curve and below price would be the producer surplus. When we calculate that, it'd be a little bit different. 100 minus 40. You see where we're getting 140. That's the height of the consumer surplus triangle. And then we're selling, in this case, only 4 units. So it would be 100 minus 40, or 60 times 4 divided by 2, or 240 divided by 2, and that would be 120. That whole area is 120. The other way that we could calculate is to simply count up those squares. If you count each one of those individual squares, you would end up with about with 120 as well. Now, the producer surplus area, the same thing, the height times the width. In this case, it's 20 minus 40 times 4 divided by 2, or 80 divided by 2, or 40. The total surplus area, or the total economic surplus area then, would be 160, the height of 100 minus 20, the width of 4, and we divide that by 2, would be 160. Note, it's another way that we check our surplus areas for the producer and the consumer. Hopefully you see this.